Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to St. Michael's Church. Most people think of Fanny Burney when it comes to thinking of creative people in Mickleham, but as she was the subject of Brian Unwin's excellent talk on Friday evening, it leaves it for me to tell you about all the others, and it's a great thrill to be able to do that. One of our subjects described the area as a colony of clever people. And as you can see from my word cloud, there were quite a few people. And of course, in the time that I have, I can't talk to you about all of those. So I've chosen a few to tell you, just to give you an overview of their lives. I've arranged the talk geographically according to where they lived or stayed here in Mickleham. And I'm working clockwise from the Burford Bridge and John Keats. John Keats came from humble origins. He was the eldest of four, and his father was an ostler. But the family sent John to the best school they could afford, which was a small boarding school with a liberal outlook and progressive curriculum. His father died in a riding accident when Keats was 8, and his mother died when he was 14. When he was 15, he was sent as an apprentice to an apothecary surgeon. And he served a 5-year apprenticeship and then qualified in 1816 with his apothecary's license, which enabled him to practice as a surgeon, apothecary, and physician. But by this time, he had decided he wanted to be a poet. And he produced his first volume of poetry in 1817. This aroused little public interest, but he was helped by new contacts and friends, and he became a figure in a new school of poetry. By this time, he was working on his epic poem, Endymion, and various family problems and other distractions were preventing his progress, and his friends suggested that he might leave London to finish it. And his friend Hazlitt suggested the pleasant suburb of Burford Bridge. And John Keats took a room overlooking the garden in the Wayside Inn at Burford Bridge, and then it was called the Fox and Hounds. And you can see here that even then, here's the river, and here's the London Road, right on the road as well. Anyway, and there he worked on Endymion. Endymion is a poem in 4 parts, each with 1,000 lines. And it was based on the Greek myth of Endymion, a shepherd beloved of the moon goddess Selene. The first line is, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever," and I will leave you to read the remaining 3,999 lines. It was published in 1819, and it received mixed reviews, some very good reviews, but unfortunately, the criticisms had the loudest voices. And these were the old school critics, such as Lockhart at Blackwoods. And he had coined the phrase, the Cockney School, for a circle of liberal intellectuals, which included Hazlitt and Keats. The dismissal was as much political as it was literary, aimed at young upstart writers deemed uncouth for their lack of education, non-formal rhyming, and low diction. what it was really saying was that they hadn't attended Eton or Harrow or Oxbridge, and that they weren't of the top classes. In the winter of 1818, this is Keats' response to that. I was never afraid of failure. I would sooner fail than not be amongst the greatest. In the winter of 1819, he produced his most mature work, but it was a sad time as well. His two brothers had been living with him, and one of them, Tom, had been ill with consumption, and Keats had been nursing him. Tom died in December 1818. At that time, there was considerable stigma attached to consumption. It was linked with weakness and repressed sexual passion. And it wasn't identified as an illness caused by a single organism until 1820. In 1819, Keats himself started displaying symptoms of consumption, and the disease progressed rapidly, and he was advised to seek warmer climes, and he left for Rome in November 1918, and he died the following January. When he died, his poems had only been published for 4 years, and he only published a few poems, including the ones I've listed here. But his fame grew after he died, and he was remembered with the warmest feelings by those who knew him. He was deeply mourned, and it's such a tragedy that he died so young. Our next subject may or may not have lived at Burford Corner. There's no documentary evidence that he lived there, and in fact, there's little documentary evidence of a large part of his life. This is Daniel Defoe, writer, trader, journalist, pamphleteer, and spy. He was an enigmatic character, prolific and versatile writer. He wrote many political tracts and was often in trouble with the authorities. He even spent some time in prison, and he was frequently in debt. And even in his day, there were inaccuracies and inconsistencies in his accounts and dealings. But what we do know is that he was born Daniel Foe. He added the D later because he thought it sounded more aristocratic. His father was a prosperous tallow chandler, and he grew up in London. And this was the time of the Great Plague and also the Great Fire of London. His mother died when he was 10. His family were Presbyterian, and he was sent to boarding school in Pixham Lane, Dorking, run by a dissenting minister. And the connection of Dorking is possibly through his mother's family, who had a connection with the Marsh family, who owned property in Pixham Lane. 50 years later, he published a tour of London and Wales. In the first volume, there's evidence of his connection with Dorking. He seemed to be very knowledgeable about the topography of the River Mole, which would have been the main area of recreation for schoolboys in Pixham Lane at that time. In the book, he refutes the claim by Camden that the River Mole is sometimes swallowed up only to bubble up and rise up 2 miles further on. Because at that time, the Burford Bridge was a footbridge and the river crossing was by ford. And he says of the ford, "I've known it so deep, the wagons and carriages have not dared to go through, but never knew it, I say, dry in the greatest time of drought." And he claims, "I lived in the neighborhood several years." So that really definitely connects him with the area. He also accounts in this book an event on Box Hill. On Box Hill, there was a place of resort for the gentry taking the waters of Epsom. They came on horseback or coach on Sunday afternoons to divert and debauch. On the top was a great beech tree, and under it a cave, which was fitted out by a Dorking vintner, this was the landlord of the King's Arms, as a place of refreshment. The place became a little fair, and it was very offensive, especially to the best governed people. It continued for 2 or 3 years, complaints alleging the reveling and indecent mirth, and on the Sabbath, failed to secure redress. And so a certain set of young men from Dorking blew the whole place up with gunpowder on a Saturday night. Now, it's quite possible that the young people were part of the dissenting Dorking dissenters, and as it was very, very hush-hush, and as Defoe seemed to know a lot about it, it's quite possible he was one of the youngsters who blew it up. Did he ever live at Burford Corner? There's no documentary evidence, but part of the building dates from that period, as you can see from the back. He knew the area, and he may have chosen to hide here from his creditors and to write Robinson Crusoe, which he published in 1719 when he was in his 50s. In summary, Defoe produced more than 300 words, books, pamphlets, and journals, and he was called the pioneer of business and economic journalism and the father of the English novel. Now we move up West Humble Street to Cleveland Lodge, which was the home of Sir James Jeans. James Jeans, physicist, mathematician, and astronomer. He could contribute a lot to the field of mathematics and was known as a giant in an age of gigantic development in science, and he had a great and honorable share in the making of that age. He held the chair of astronomy at the Royal Institution between 1935 and 1946, but perhaps he's best known as the writer of popular books about astronomy. These were very popular with school children, including my husband. and one of his fans declared, "He is the publicity agent of the eternal stars. He makes them more exciting than the comets and meteors of Hollywood." He moved to Cleveland Lodge in 1918 with his American wife, Charlotte. She was the granddaughter of the founder of Tiffany & Co. They had met while he was a professor of applied mathematics at Princeton. The association of mathematics and music is an accepted one, and at one time, James had considered music as a career. But even though he chose mathematics, music played a very big part in his life. He had an organ built in Cleveland Lodge and spent many hours playing, but only to himself. He was an intensely shy and private man and would never play before others. Charlotte died in 1934, and he mourned her deeply. In the spring of 1935, he attended an organ concert at Cambridge University, and the soloist was a young Susie Hawke. In July, James invited Susie and a violinist friends to a dinner party at Cleveland Lodge and to play afterwards. And James was so enamored of her playing and of her, they were married 2 months later. And James was 58 and Susie was 24. As a wedding present, he gave her a 2-manual neo-Baroque organ. and her many concerts on the instrument were to have a powerful influence. So that James and Susie could both play at the same time, he designed and built a soundproof room onto the north side of Cleveland Lodge. They had been married only 11 years when he died, aged 69 in 1946. Susie continued her musical career. Her concert tours took her all over the world. And she turned James's study and music room into a venue for her annual festival. She also held an annual summer school for organists, and many of her students became the best players of the next generation. At her music festivals, she held them in late May, early June, when the rhododendrons in the garden were at their best. It started off as the Mickleham West Humble Festival, but the name was later changed to the Box Hill Festival. At the time of her death in 1993, there were no fewer than 6 organs in Cleveland Lodge, in addition to many other keyboard instruments. A Mickleham resident attended one of her lost festivals and wrote this about the evening. Although in failing health and overwhelmed by paper and household worries in her last years, Susie had only to seat herself at the organ for all her mundane cares to drop away and for her entire person to be lifted into the spheres of music. And to watch this transformation was an unforgettable and inspiring experience. Now we move up to Norbury Park. Norbury Park was bought by William Locke in 1774. At that time, the main house was down by the river, and he actually built the house on the top of the hill and set out the parkland. He was well known in society and a friend and supporter of Fanny Burney and the French emigres living at Juniper Hall. William's wife, Frederica, was a member of the Blue Stocking Society. This was founded in 1750s, and it was an informal social and educational movement. And it was the meetings of intelligent and educated women to discuss art and literature. Politics was banned. The meetings often included learned gentlemen, and Boswell suggests the name derived from the fact that a popular and frequent participant was a man who wore blue stockings. Fanny Burney was a member, and another member and friend of Mrs. Locke was Elizabeth Upton. Sculptor and artist. After her marriage to the wonderfully named Clotworthy Upton, they went on an extended grand tour, and she immersed herself in the study of the classical literature and art. And she studied sculpting, and some of her sculptures still exist, including this one. It was very unusual for a woman to take up sculpture. And when she returned to England, she took up a more womanly art of paper cutting. And her elegant designs were seen by Josiah Wedgwood, and he thought that they would transfer very well to his jasperware, which features white bas-relief figures on a colored background. And here are examples of some of Lady Templeton's designs. And this one, which is known as the Nova Nupta. And I want you to notice this particularly because we're going to see it again. It's quite possible that during her stays at Norbury Park, she was introduced to Sir Cecil Bishop, who lived at Fredley. In 1762, Bishop bought the Royal Oak, which was a wayside inn on the London Road opposite his property. He transformed and extended it and renamed it Juniper Hall. This was at the time when neoclassicism was at its height, led by Robert Adam. And it was possible that through the Locks, he arranged for Elizabeth to advise on the design of his drawing room of the new house, known today as the Templeton Room at Juniper Hall. And if you look there over the fireplace, you see the Nova Nupta. It means new bride, if I haven't said that already. And then if you go back up to Norbury Park, you see it here again, there. A more recent resident of Norbury Park was Maury Stokes. She grew up in a well-to-do, educated family. Her father was an architect and a paleontologist. Following her science degree at UCL, she undertook the postgraduate studies in paleobotany, the study of fossil plants. And she earned a doctorate from the University of Munich. Age 24, she became the assistant lecturer of botany at the University of Manchester. She was the first female academic at that university. Her research on fossil plants included coal and was applied to problems in the coal mining industry. During her time in Munich, she had had a torrid affair with a married colleague, and her later marriage to a Canadian botanist was very unhappy, and it was eventually annulled due to non-consummation. These experiences played a huge role in determining her future career and causing her to turn her attention to the issues of sex, marriage, and childbirth, and their meaning in society. And she saw birth control as an aid to marriage fulfillment and as a means to save women from the physical strain of excessive childbearing. In 1918, she married Humphrey Roe, co-founder with his brother of the A.V. Roe aircraft firm, and he shared her interest in birth control, and he helped her in her crusade. In 1918, she published a book, Married Love, which caused quite a stir, as you can imagine. It was despite being banned in certain places, it became very popular with her target audience, target readers, and was widely translated. Her later book on contraception was, when it was first published, the most comprehensive treatment of the subject. She and Humphrey opened their first birth control clinic in Holloway in 1921, and there were very more to follow. It was open to all married women, designed to educate a woman about her body and the few methods of birth control available at that time. She and Humphrey moved to Norbury Park in 1938, and she lived there until her death in 1958. There are other facets of her life, but it's no time to go into those today. Suffice it to say, Maury was an extraordinary woman who had a marked influence on women's health and happiness. Our next subject also had an interest in birth control. In 1832, he was walking across St. James's Park on his way to work, and he saw a bundle under a tree. Upon investigation, he discovered it was the body of a newborn baby which had been strangled. When he reported his find to a watchman, he was told that this was not unusual. London was full of poor people who could not afford another child. Not long after, he was arrested in a working class area while distributing pamphlets on advocating a method of contraception. He was found guilty of promoting obscenity and spent a few days in prison. This was 17-year-old John Stuart Mill, who would subsequently become the highest-ranking philosopher of his century. His father was James Mill, historian, economist, political theorist, and philosopher. He was Scottish. His father was a shoemaker, but James rose from humble background through education. He was ordained as a minister of the Church of Scotland, but decided to devote himself to literary work. He's made his name in the publication of the book, The History of the British India, in 1817. This was in 3 volumes, Hindu India, Muslim India, and British India. It was an immediate and enduring success, and on the strength of it, he was offered a job with the East India Company in London. He was a friend of Jeremy Bentham, an apostle of his theory of utilitarianism, which was a rational philosophy founded on the scientific promotion of the greatest good for the greatest number. John Stuart was his firstborn, and James had at that time considered that a child's mind was a blank slate, which was shaped entirely by their life experiences, especially those of childhood. As part of an experiment, he undertook John's education himself. Luckily for him and for his son, John was an able student. At age 7, he was reading Plato in Greek. And by 11, Aristotle's work on logic, and at 12, moving on to political economy. Apparently, at this stage, John enjoyed his studies. However, it was a very austere and lonely childhood, with little social contact, aloof from his 4 siblings, and his mother was a remote figure. He had no toys, and his father considered that holidays encouraged laziness. I think a lot of his Calvinistic background was showing here. And there was no place for emotions. In fact, in his autobiography, it is claimed that his childhood was totally lacking in love. In his late teens, John was breaking free from his despotic father and making friends, and he had discovered poetry. By this time, it seems that James had loosened up a bit, because somewhere between 1824 and 1828, James took a weekend house in Mickleham. This was described as a small house opposite the church, but not facing it, there being another one in front. So where could that be? Here's the church. Anyway, you can see where the church is. And directly opposite the church is the running horses. So I think it must have been in Swaners Lane, not facing the church. The main buildings in Swaners Lane were those to do with the pub, and also they were the outbuildings for Mickleham Hall. I don't know, the one directly by the arrow, I think this is an 1841 map, which is about 15 years after the Mills lived there. So perhaps that house was built after that, because Thomas Carlyle, it was, by the way, it was James Mill who coined the phrase colony of clever people. Thomas Carlyle, who visited, described a pretty country, a pretty village of an English straggling wooded sort. The Mills have joined some old carpenter shops together, connected by shed roof passages, a little drawing room door of glass looking out onto a rose garden, into plains, and half-mile off to a respectable wooded and open, broad-shouldered green hill. So I think it must have been some of the farm buildings, but it still had a view of the countryside. So we'll have to investigate that a bit further. The family stayed at the house 6 months of the year. And James spent his 6 weeks holiday there and then came down every weekend, which was a 3-hour coach ride, usually sitting on top of the coach in all weathers. The acquisition of this cottage occurred just a few years after the baby in the park incident. And John Stewart, by this, was growing a love of the countryside and botany, spent as much of his time possible in Mickleham. James died in 1836, and records show that the whole family retired to the cottage at Mickleham after the funeral, but there's no further mention of Mickleham after that. John Stuart Mill, his biography is subtitled Victorian Firebrand. He was a radical liberal, philosopher, political economist, politician, and civil servant. I could spend the whole hour telling you about John Stuart Mill, but there's only time for a quick mention. The idea at the heart of his life and work was individual freedom. His image of a good society, where every man and woman can shape the course of their own life, but this was not a sort of do what you care, laissez-faire style. His image was of flourishing human life, self-improving, passionate, truth-seeking, engaged, and colorful, the duty of the individual to cultivate, and the duty of society to promote. The worth of a state is the worth of the individuals composing it. He was an extraordinary man, a great thinker, and in his day, the highest ranking philosopher of his century and the foremost intellectual of British history. And you often see his quotes today, because they're very applicable. And I've just chosen a few to share with you today. There are many truths of which the full meaning cannot be realized until personal experiences has brought it home. How can great minds be produced in a country where the test of great minds is agreeing in the opinion of small minds? And this one for the cancel culture. Truth emerges from the clash of adverse ideas. When one's ideas are not challenged, one's ability to defend them weakens. It is not because men's desires are strong that they act ill. It is because their consciences are weak. And a party of order and stability and a party of progress and reform are both necessary elements of a healthy state of political life. Next, we go to someone else who chose Mickleham as his country retreat. This is Richard Sharp. I'm sorry I don't have a photograph of him. According to my researchers, there was only one portrait exists, and it's in the Bodleian Library, and I was unable to find a copy in time for my talk. He was a hat maker, banker, merchant, poet, critic, MP, and conversationalist. And I've included him because he was creative in the sense that he brought things together and made things happen. He came from a family of hat makers. His father died when he was 6. He was educated by a private tutor and then apprenticed to a hat maker. And at age 18, he inherited his grandfather's share of a long-established and successful hat-making business. He later became a merchant. His family money and winning personality allowed him to enter the ranks of society. He dined regularly with Boswell. In his 30s, he was described as already a figure in society, where his great conversational powers and his unbounded goodness of heart made him universally welcome, and he earned the nickname Conversation Sharp. He was once described as the most considerable merchant in London, and he left an estate valued at around £50 million in today's money. At various times, he represented the Whig Party as a dissenting member of Parliament. Although he achieved distinction in many areas, he seems to have made most impact simply by his basic human kindness and wisdom. In 1797, he chose Fredley Farmhouse as his rural retreat, and many eminent men and women visited him there to enjoy the quiet of the countryside, and the gatherings were famed for their witty and learned conversations. And this is a list provided by his adopted daughter, Maria. You can see that besides politicians, statesmen, economists, and philosophers, there were poets and writers: Coleridge, Washington Irving, Sir Walter Scott, Sheridan, Wordsworth, and scientists: Babbage, Sir Humphrey Davy, Faraday, Mary Somerville, and James Watt. The historian Macaulay wrote this about Richard Sharp. The other day, I had a long talk with Sharp about everything and everybody: metaphysics, poetry, politics, scenery, and paintings. One thing I've observed in Sharp, which is quite peculiar to him among town wits and diners out: he never talks scandal. If he can say nothing good of a man, he holds his tongue. I do not, of course, mean that in confidential communications about politics, he does not speak freely of public men, but about the follies of individuals, I do not believe that, as much as I have talked with him, I have ever heard him utter one word, and I passed 3 or 4 hours very agreeable in his company. A more recent inhabitant of Fredley Manor is James Clavell, novelist, screenwriter, and director. His father was a Royal Naval commander who had served in China before World War I, and he shared his passion for the Far East with James during his childhood. When World War II broke out, James left school early to join the army. In 1942, he was captured in Java, aged 18. He was later transferred to the notorious Changi prison, and he was a prisoner of war for 4 years. He said it was his university. Fellow inmates were experts in all walks of life. He studied everything from physics to counterfeiting, and above all, learned the art of survival. He was deeply affected by his experiences, and for a long time after his release, carried a tin of sardines in his pocket. At university, he met his actress wife, April Stride, and became interested in filmmaking when he visited her on the film set. In the early 50s, he moved to Hollywood and started writing screenplays. And in 1960, when the Screenwriters Guild went on strike and he had no work, in 3 months, he wrote his first novel, King Rat, based on his experiences at Changi. And the later part of his career, he focused on novel writing. And here's a list of the various things he was involved in. You can see that one of the things was he was the co-writer for The Great Escape, and co-writer, director, and co-producer of To Sir with Love. Most of his novels were set in the Far East, which is surprising after his time at Changi, but because he had this deep-seated passion for the Far East, he chose to that as a setting for most of his novels. His novels were meticulously researched and written. He was very much in control. He wrote at his own pace, refused to be ruled by publishers' deadlines, and it was only when the novel was finished that the publishers had a chance to have a look at it. He bought Fredley Manor in 1970. By that time, the humble farmhouse had been transferred into quite a sizable dwelling, and the name had been changed to Fredley Manor. He lived there until 1990, but the Clavell family only used it for short breaks because they also had houses in London, the USA, France, and Austria, and his researchers would have taken him to other places in the world. He died of a stroke in Switzerland in 1994. Now we move down the road and to Marie Corelli, and there's quite a lot of creativity associated with Marie Corelli, not only in her writing, but also in her private life. She was a novelist, and her first book in 1886 was panned by the critics, but the public loved it. It was 10 years after the introduction of the compulsory education, and many ordinary people had learned to read, and their desire for new books worked in her favor. Within 10 years, she was the best-selling author in Britain. Her most successful novel, The Sorrow of Satan, was published in 1895, priced at 6 shillings, which was about £40 today. And it sold 200,000 copies. Amongst her fans, not just shop girls, but Queen Victoria, the Prince of Wales, and Gladstone. Marie was fiercely protective of her reputation. She avoided being seen in public, had a positive terror of being photographed. Poor Marie was not endowed with natural beauty. Mark Twain met her when she was in her 50s and made a note in his diary. She is fat and shapeless, has a gross animal face, and dresses for 16. Eventually, her style of writing fell out of fashion, and she spent her last years in Stratford-on-Avon. It was only after her death in 1924 did the world discover the mystery surrounding her life. Her origins were traced back to Mickleham and Ferndale Cottage, home of Dr. Charles Mackay, editor of the Illustrated London News. And you can see it here. You see Jennifer here hall at the top, and you go south. And Ferndale was right on the corner of the zigzag road going up to Box Hill. The village story was that she had been left as a baby on the doorstep of Ferndale, and that Dr. Mackay had adopted her and named her Mary. In fact, well, most likely, she was his daughter by his housekeeper. Dr. Mackay married the housekeeper a year after his wife died. By the time her first book was published, she was calling herself Mari Corelli, and she told her publisher that she had an Italian father and was descended from the Italian composer Arcangelo Corelli. The family left Ferndale in 1884, and a few years later it burned down. The site is now occupied by St. Joe's Lodge. And we go around the corner in the zigzag to our last subject, Sir George Meredith. George's mother died when he was 5, and his father was a failed businessman. But a legacy through her mother's family funded his education. Some of it was in Germany. At 18, he was articled to a solicitor, but he abandoned the legal profession for journalism and poetry. His novels were innovative in their attention to characters' psychology, and also took a close interest in social change. His style in both poetry and prose was noted for its syntactic complexity. And apparently his forte was comedy. Much of his early writing attracted little notice. Oscar Wilde likened it to chaos, illumined by brilliant flashes of lightning. He had married in 1849, but disappointment and poverty put a strain on married life. In the 1860s, he posed for the painter Henry Wallace as a model for this painting of the Death of Chatterton. Thomas Chatterton had been a boy poet who committed suicide. Meredith's wife attended many of the sittings and formed a relationship with Wallace and ran off with him after the painting was finished. She died a few years later, aged 40. This was a low period in Meredith's life when writing was his only solace, but he was forced to supplement his income as a reader for a publishing company and to write in his free time. The turning point came in 1864 when a review of his latest novel caught the public eye. That same year, he married Marie Volney, daughter of a wealthy wool merchant who lived in the old house, Mickleham. It was a love match. She was 24 and he was a 36-year-old widower. In 1867, they moved into Flint Cottage, and he built a chalet where he could write undisturbed in the garden. He used to climb Box Hill every morning before he started work, and he loved the countryside and founded a group of friends which was called the Sunday Tramps, who walked all over the Surrey Hills on a Sunday. Over the next few years, he made his name mainly as an encourager for novelists, as well as an influence on them. And those to benefit were Robert Louis Stevenson, Thomas Hardy, Henry James, and J.M. Barrie. J.M. Barrie, as a young man, decided he would come down to Mickleham and call on the great man. And by the time he got here, his nerve had failed him, And he sat on the bank opposite the house to get up courage to knock on the door. And here we have today, and this cowslip covered bank on Box Hill is still known as Barry's Bank. I don't know whether he actually met him on that day, but it went on that Meredith became his patron, and after Meredith's death, Barry was one of the people who helped sort out his papers. Meredith was known as the last great Victorian. His works are largely unread today, but he left a lasting legacy. His poem, The Lark Ascending, inspired Vaughan Williams to compose the nation's favorite piece of music. And it should be playing. Thank you. I don't know, are there any questions? I'm an amateur historian, so I may not be able to answer them, but I'll try. Yes?
So, do you know where the W is temple child? The temple to Rome.
Yes.
She was temple child.
Yes, I know. Yes.
When was that dropped?
Yeah, it was then dropped, yeah. Yes, thank you.
Do you know when?
When? I don't know. No, sorry. Yeah. Yes, Sandra.
I've heard that the funeral procession of Meredith from St. Cottage into St. Martin's was apparently something quite extraordinary.
Yes. Yeah.
Many carriages and horses.
Yes. Yes. And he's buried in Dorking Cemetery because he couldn't be buried in Westminster Abbey because he was a dissenter, I think. Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting. So many of these people were from dissenters. It was really remarkable, the number of people there. And I think it was probably because these people were questioning what was happening and challenging, and therefore creating new. Yeah. Yes? I can't hear you. Sorry.
Something I didn't know about. But she remembers Mary's folks coming in to buy learning powders for her dog. Not a question, but maybe her intent.
Was that just a comment?
Just a comment.
Yeah. Yes.
didn't have time to talk about Cyril Hare.
No.
He was, of course, Gordon Clark,
Yeah.
who lived
Yes, Sandra's father.
right next to the railway station in West London.
Yes.
And we read all his novels. Because my wife and I are both lawyers, and we understand the sting of the law. And now he is buried in this churchyard.
Yeah.
But any of the other people who talked about buried here?
Are any of the other people buried here that you've talked about? Yes. Just the locks, I think.
The Willoughbys are.
The Willoughbys, yes, they are too. That's right.
Fanny Burney is buried in Bath.
Yeah.
I might say that we have Maggie and Martin Burgess here, and young Martin Burgess was engaged by James Clavell as a very young sort of horticulturist to do some projects in his garden, and they lived at Michaela's cottage at Fredley and looked after the property for 15 years for the Clavells. Yeah. Yeah.
Mentioning that one Cyril Hare books, The Yew Tree's Shade, actually gives very good descriptions of Boxhill.
Yeah.
And it created a character in it called Henry Spicer, who's actually George Meredith.
Yeah.
And it's quite amusing to read it because it talks about the amount of litter. It talks about the amount of litter on Box Hill and what people get up to. So rather than it's with Defoe, it's diverting and debauching.
Yeah. Yes.
I understand that George Meredith was Queen Victoria's favourite poet. That's what we were told. And he's, as I say, he's buried in Dorking Cemetery. And every year there was an annual pilgrimage from society that visited his grave to remember him and made flowers.
Yeah, I did hear that.
George Meredith was Queen Victoria's favourite poet.
Yeah. Well, that's
Is that it?
Oh. Thank you very much.
Sue, we really want to thank you for such an interesting talk. And I know that a huge amount of research has gone into this.
Yeah.
So, it's absolutely fascinating. And for some of the people who are very famous, it's really hard to find what their connections are here.
Yeah.
Like, John Stuart Mill and
Yeah.
where he lived.
Yeah.
Yes,
But that's still a mystery.
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much. And there are refreshments, so please do stay and have a cup of tea.